Up next, Gordon and I take a look at the Fujifilm X-H1 on the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Hi, this is Doug Kay. I'm here with the ultimate, the only Mr. Camera Labs, Gordon Lang. Hi, Gordon. How you doing?
I'm good, Doug. How are you? Fortunately, there is only one. Can you imagine if there was more?
It would drive me crazy. Absolutely drive me crazy.
Do you know, Doug, I was at the photography show in Birmingham, England, the other day, and loads of people came up to me, recognized me from the podcast, the stuff we do on YouTube. Every single one of them said, "Where's Doug? We want more Doug." Didn't care about me. Didn't go, "Nice to see you, Gordon. Like your work." It's all, "Doug, we want more Doug." So I'm very pleased that we've recorded another one of these shows. Now, this is, of course, our longer, in-depth review. If you're after a shorter kind of first looks review, I would like to point you towards my first looks video of the X-H1. That will take you over all the highlights in about 10 minutes. But if you have a longer period at your disposal, and after all, you should, if you're going to be buying a camera like this, you know, you're going to be spending a couple of grand on it. You should spend some time researching it. Then stick with us during this video or podcast, and we'll tell you all about it. So, Doug, this is, I've got the X-H1 here. This is a high-end mirrorless camera with the 24 megapixel APS-C sensor, built-in stabilization, 4K video, and up to 14 frames per second burst shooting. It's the new flagship in Fujifilm's X series, which means it's positioned above the existing X-T2 and X Pro 2. And an easy way to think about it, if you're familiar with Fujifilm's range, is to imagine the X-T2, so same sensor, same battery, much the same kind of features, but is a tougher version with a bigger grip, high resolution viewfinder, touchscreen, Bluetooth, some enhanced video capabilities, and most importantly of all, in a first for Fujifilm, built-in image stabilization that adjusts the sensor. So, Doug, how much are we looking at for an X-H1?
X-H1 here in the US is about $1,900. That's if you don't, it's with no lens, and that's if you don't get the optional grip. That optional grip is another $300 for that, so it comes in around $2,200 US with the grip.
And it's important that we qualify that price with the grip because, as you'll discover throughout this review, a lot of the X-H1's features don't really become fully realized until you've got that grip attached. So it's important to think that if you are going to buy this camera, you are probably going to be buying it with that grip as well. So think about spending $2,200. So let's put that into some sort of perspective. How does that compare to the other models in the X series?
Yeah, the X-T2, which is the one that you've just mentioned, is essentially $300 less expensive. $1,600 without the grip, about $1,930 with the grip. So $300 less expensive, roughly.
Okay, and of course, there are other models in the range that share the same sensor. So if it is just that 24 megapixel Fujifilm quality you're after, what can you get that in?
Yeah, that's interesting because you can go down to the X-T20 for only $900 in the US. It saves you $1,000. And all the way down to the X-E3, which is only $900. You could buy two X-E3s for the price of this camera. And I believe it's the same sensor and the same processor, Fuji's latest.
Yeah, and also because the autofocus system is embedded within the sensor, you get much the same autofocus as well. There are some little tweaks as you go throughout the range, but you are getting essentially the same image quality, essentially the same autofocus throughout all of those models. So let's look at what makes this different. But before that, what about some rival models at around the same sort of price? Because there are quite a few higher-end mirrorless cameras out right now. So we've got one that we reviewed recently, the Panasonic Lumix G9.
Yeah, the G9, which of course is a Micro Four Thirds sensor, slightly smaller, $1,700. So you would save $200 going to the Lumix G9. So same ballpark, slightly smaller sensor.
Okay, now we've got two options from Sony. We've got the A6500, which is their APS-C product. How much is that?
Yeah, the 6500 now is $1,400 US. So that's $500 less than this new Fujifilm.
And that was interesting because that one was their first APS-C model with built-in stabilization.
Right.
But much more interesting, though, is the Sony A7 III, which is a full-frame product. How much does that cost?
Yeah, that camera is only $100 more than this APS-C Fujifilm, coming in at $2,000 almost exactly. Like you say, different animal to some extent because of the full frame, but it does have the image stabilization.
Yeah, it has an awful lot, the Sony A7 III, and that's really put the cat among the pigeons, really, because they've come up with such a fully featured camera that doesn't seem to be really kind of limited in that many ways, other than the fact that one of the things that makes it great, the full frame aspect, is one of the things that's going to make it perhaps more expensive and larger over time, in that when you are buying lenses for it, they are generally, especially the good ones, are going to be quite large, quite heavy, but still $2,000 for a full frame camera, which, as we'll discover throughout the review, has got some pretty compelling features. So the X-H1 may be Fujifilm's top end X series body, but it enters a market that just keeps getting more and more competitive. So if we kind of get started on this and have a look at the body, it is the biggest and heftiest in the X series. I've got it mounted here with the XF16 to 55 millimeter zoom, and I remember this was a zoom which looked pretty big when I had it mounted on the X-T2 when I tested this lens, but it looks perfectly normal on the X-H1. It's a very nicely balanced combination, but it's feeling pretty heavy in my hands. To put it in some perspective, this looks, I've heard a lot of comments from people saying, well, look, there's no benefit now over a DSLR size-wise. Well, there is, because this is still comfortably lighter and a little bit smaller than, say, a Nikon D500. So it is smaller and lighter than a comparable DSLR, but for a mirrorless camera, regardless of the sensor inside it, it's getting up there. Well, it's not getting up there. It is there. It is big. It's a big camera. And a lot of comments that I've read, again, from people saying, oh, what's the point of mirrorless on a body this big? Well, I would say, well, actually, even though one of the things that attracted me towards mirrorless originally was its size, the thing that really sold it for me was electronic composition. That to me is the most important thing. Interestingly, a thing that DSLR owners and a lot of traditional photographers see as the downside of mirrorless, to me, is actually the benefit, which is this ability to be able to preview anything, white balance effects through the electronic viewfinder, the ability to play back images through the viewfinder, to film video, playback video, to perform magnification, focus peaking, zebra patterns, all of these things you can do with an electronic viewfinder. So for me, that is much more of a benefit than a compact size. But I have to say, I'm holding this camera up. and I'm going to have to change hands here because it is quite heavy. But you are getting this significantly bigger grip than before. Well, it's a grip. The other models didn't really have one, and if I put my hands around it, my little finger, there's plenty of room here. It's not left dangling. I'm going to show you Fujifilm's biggest lens now. This is the one. Yeah, look at the size of that fella. This is a 100 to 400 millimeter, and it is a big, heavy lens, but it feels right at home on the X-H1. So if you're the kind of person who is shooting with lenses like the 16 to 55, the 100 400, or I think it's a 50 to 140. I always get it the wrong way around. Sometimes I call it 40 to 150, but that's the Olympus. So I think it's 50 to 140, but you know what I mean. If you're using those bigger Fujifilm lenses, you're going to like the X-H1 because it gives you a lot more to hold on to, and it feels a lot more comfortable. I mean, what do you think, Doug? Just looking at it very briefly, what are your first impressions on the way this camera looks?
Well, it looks like a monster. It does make that lens look smaller than it did on the other bodies, that's for sure. I just want to mention, we spent years in the beginning talking about one of the advantages of mirrorless being smaller and lighter. And we kept warning people that's not really the issue. That's temporarily the issue. That was their advantage in the beginning. But as you say, now it's the computational computing. And you forgot some of the greatest features, things like face detection. And being able to track objects in real time. That's something that you just can't get with a DSLR. Anyway, it looks great. Of course, I love Fuji controls, so this is in that same family, right?
Yeah, I mean, before we move on to the controls, I wanted to mention the kind of toughness of this, because it does look like a kind of beefed up version of the X-T2. Fujifilm's actually increased the thickness of the magnesium alloy shell. It's 25% thicker than before, and thanks to square laws and things, that makes it twice as tough overall. And their coating on this is more scratch resistant. And in your hands, it certainly feels very confident. It's very, very solid, very, very dense. I mean, I've not dropped this camera on my foot, but I would fear for my toes if I did. If we have a look at the design, as you said, Doug, it kind of, well, to me, it's kind of the camera you would get if the X-T2 and the GFX medium format had a bit too big a night out together and had a baby. Then this would be it, the X-H1. There's definitely a lot of the X-T2 and of the GFX in there. So if we have a look at the top surface, you can see the lockable shutter speed and ISO dials of the X-T2, again with the collars around each of those for the drive mode. And the metering. Now, this, along with the aperturing on the lenses, allows you to just dial in that shutter speed and aperture. And I know, Doug, that is something you really like. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I love walking around. Don't tell anybody this. This is our secret, Gordon. I love walking around the streets with everything set to automatic. And then if I want a particular shutter speed, I dial it in, put it back. If I want a particular aperture, I dial it in and put it back. I love not having to go to soft controls because I can never remember which soft control controls which function. And here it's very, very clear. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of flip side to that is the shutter speed dial is, again, in 1 EV increments. So it's like, 250th, 500th, 1000th of a second, and so on. So if you want to access those in between speeds, you actually use the rear dial here, the thumb dial. And if you're doing that, it kind of feels to me like you're setting the shutter speed with 2 controls there rather than just the one. You can set the shutter speed dial to T, and then it becomes like everyone else's digital camera. Then you control the shutter speed entirely with that rear dial. So it kind of, I like it and I don't like it. So I want to show you something else, Doug, and I've got the camera set to the T mode now. And what the T mode lets you do is dial in any shutter speed at all, from the fastest shutter speed of 8,000th of a second if you're using the mechanical shutter, or 32,000th if you're using the electronic shutter, all the way down to 30 seconds and beyond. Now, if I show you now just using this top screen, and actually, this is as good a time as any to mention this top screen, because where the exposure compensation dial of the old XT2 used to be, you've now got the same screen that was on the GFX medium format. And this is kind of like one of those Kindle e-ink displays. It's black and white, but it's incredibly visible regardless of the lighting, whether it's really stark and bright or really dark. And you can also press a button. That was it backlit. This is it normally. So you've got kind of white text on a black background. And when it catches the light, you can just see that so easily. Hopefully what you'll be able to see on this is that it says 30 seconds at the top. And this is the longest exposure that most cameras offer. It's just an arbitrary thing. Why do they stop at 30 seconds? Well, Olympus and Panasonic actually continue on to 1 minute. And in fact, so can the X-H1. So that's quite nice. If you're into long exposures, it can go to 1 minute. But in a feature inherited from the XE3, you can just keep turning this dial and it will go to 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, and up to 15 minutes. Can you see that now? 15 minutes on the display.
Looks fascinating.
Now, as you know, I'm really into long exposure photography. This is an absolute dream for me. There's no need to have a cable release. There's no need to even go into any menus and select bulb timers or anything like that. I can just set this to however many minutes I want, admittedly, in those increments, but still, it's fine. And then I just set the self-timer and take the picture, and that's it. Here's a picture I took on Brighton Beach of the Old West Pier. It's a 4-minute exposure. All I did is dial in 4 minutes. I had a Lee neutral density filter on the front of my lens. Dead easy, nothing to it. And the other nice thing about the Fujifilm sensor is that it delivers very, very clean results for long exposures, even with long exposure noise reduction disabled. So this to me is a really nice feature. Not brand new on the X-H1 because it was on the XE3, and it will probably be deployed on some other models with firmware updates. But I love that. I think that's fantastic. And, I think we should get away from, this arbitrary 30-second limit. While we're talking about this top screen, though, it is, in fact, a 128 by 128 pixel display that can show anything you want. So, I mean, at the moment, you can see that it has the shutter speed, the ISO, aperture, things like that, metering mode. But if I set the camera to its movie mode here, notice how it's changed. Mm-hmm. It now shows minutes remaining. It's got the actual movie quality. And now watch this. If I put it back to stills and I switch the camera off, okay, so it's off now. Look, the display is still active because it consumes so little power, and it will tell you how many shots remain. You can see that battery indicator in the corner as well. This reminds me of old film SLRs. They would always just tell you, or in fact, some Nikon DSLRs do that as well. They still tell you how many shots you've got just at a glance. I don't even need to turn it on to find out if my battery is about to die or not. So I really like that. Now, at first, when this display was deployed on the GFX, I thought, I'm not sure about it. But now I've come to really like it. But the flip side of it is that it feels to me that you've got kind of like the XT2 for most of this camera. And then it turns into, so you've got this kind of retro vintage style on one side, and then this modern style on the other. You'll notice that the shutter release is now a softer touch shutter release. It's no longer threaded for an old style cable release. It's pushed forward rather than on the body, and you've lost that exposure compensation style. I never missed that because it always turned by mistake when I pulled the camera out, so I don't care about that. But it feels to me that I don't know. It feels design-wise a little bit confused. What do you think, Doug?
I haven't used it, so I can't give you a first-hand comment. I would miss the exposure compensation. That's something I use quite a bit. So that would be a disadvantage for me. However, those screens are really nice. I mean, I had that on many of my Nikons for many years, those little screens with all sorts of information. I sort of miss that. Anytime I can avoid going into the menus, that's a plus.
And remember, this is a dot matrix display, so it's completely configurable. You can actually go into the menus and say, look, I'm not interested in shots remaining. I'd prefer to use that space for some different information. So you can configure it. And I think Fujifilm should run with that, actually, and let you upload a custom graphic to it so it powers up and shows your company logo or something like that. I think that would be really fun. Anyway, moving on, around the back of the camera, you've still got the AF joystick as before. You'll notice that one of the older buttons, the AF lock button, now becomes an AF on button and is bigger than before. I like bigger buttons. This camera is a bigger camera. It should have bigger buttons. I feel that the cross keys on the back are a little bit small, actually. I think there was an opportunity for Fujifilm to have made them a bit bigger. They're bigger even on the X Pro 2. I wish they'd had that for starters. It seems like there's an awful lot of space on the back of this camera that could have been used to have bigger controls. So good that they put bigger buttons for the AF on button, but bad that they didn't do it for the cross keys. You'll also notice there's no movie record button on this. You actually have to trigger that with the shutter release. And even though you can reconfigure and customize almost all the buttons on this, I couldn't find a way. I might have missed it. I couldn't personally find a way to reconfigure one of these buttons to trigger the movie recording. So, that's a little bit odd. Moving on, the viewfinder is roughly the same magnification as before. It's fractionally smaller, 0.75 times compared to, I think, 0.77 times or 7.8 on the XT2. You're not going to notice that in side by side. But what you will notice is that the X-H1 now has a higher resolution electronic viewfinder. It's the latest 3.69 million dot OLEDs that you find on the Lumix G9 and the Sony A7R III, not the A7 III, which sticks with the older 2.36 million dot viewfinder. Now, when you have them side by side, you don't really notice much difference in that detail until you see very, very, very fine details, so like fencing in the distance, which becomes kind of fuzzy and badly resolved on the older panels, but much better resolved on the new ones. And as these panel resolutions increase, the view becomes more and more natural, and it also becomes easier to manually focus it without magnifying it or use things like focus peaking in movies. I really like those high resolution displays. Doug, what do you think of the EVFs these days?
I mean, my vision's so bad. They're all great for me, but you're right. They've gotten substantially better, particularly about things like the lag in the viewfinder. Can you have any comments about that? Is the viewfinder pretty responsive?
Yes, it is very responsive for normal things. Now, in terms of viewfinder blackout, it's the same as the XT2, just about, which means if you're shooting at, I think it's 5 frames per second or slower, you get live feedback. If you're shooting at 8 frames per second or faster, you get a slight delay. You're looking at the last picture taken. So in those regards, it's actually a little bit behind the competition. Most of its rivals can do 8 frames per second with live feedback or faster if you're willing to put up with that last picture. But still, you can shoot action. You were talking about your eyesight and also your glasses wearer, Doug. You'll notice that the viewfinder eye cup is bigger than on the XT2, and the head itself also protrudes further. I've been told by people who wear glasses, I don't myself, not yet anyway, that this is more comfortable to frame with when wearing glasses than the XT2. Although I should mention that the downside to having this bigger, another reason they did it sticking out more at the back is that your nose wouldn't interact with the screen, which is now touch sensitive. But the downside to that is that when you do flip the screen up, you'll notice that quite a lot of it is actually obstructed by the viewfinder now.
Really is,
yeah. You can see that. And if I was to, I'll switch it on so we can actually have a better look at that. So you can see the profile of that viewfinder cup over the screen, and the screen isn't, because of the way the articulation works, you can't yank it out any further away from it. Some of them on some cameras they can actually kind of pull out a little bit, and you can get over that. You can't with this, which is a bit of a pain. Talking about the screen, it's the same articulation that the XT2 had, which is quite unusual. So it will flip up, as you can see here, by 90 degrees. This is for your waist level shooting, or it will angle down by about 45 degrees for when you're shooting over the heads of crowds. Now, of course, that's no use at all, as we know, if you are framing, as I do so much, in the portrait orientation. So what Fujifilm introduced on the X-T2, and now the X-H1 inherits it, but with an easier button control. On the X-T2, it's a switch you needed to unlock. Now it's just a button. You can actually press this button in and angle the screen out sideways. It's only by it's a bit more than 45 degrees. It's probably about 60 degrees. But this makes it much easier to frame at low angles in the portrait orientation, or when you're holding it above your head, over crowds. What this screen won't do, though, is flip forward to face the subject. It's not side hinged like, say, the Lumix G9 or the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II or the Canon EOS M50. This makes it less useful for vlogging, and I know that whenever I say vlogging, a lot of people go, vlogging, who does that? Oh, well, if they want to vlog, they should be using a video camera. And it's like, well, no, I don't think so. I mean, I've filmed pieces to camera. I'm elevating vlogging to something else here, but I want to see myself to see. I'll give you an example, right? This camera, the X-H1, does have pretty good autofocus and stabilization, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I did do a vlogging test, which you'll see later on. And the first time I filmed that, because I couldn't see myself, I was filming blind. I played it back. Technically, it was perfect, but I had a great big bit of ketchup on the side of my face from my lunch, and I couldn't see that. A screen which flipped forward, I'd have been able to see that straight away. It's things like that. So they kind of... There's pros and cons to not having a side hinge screen. People who shoot a lot of street, and there are a lot of street photographers who use the Fujifilm series, so I get this. A screen that can angle with just one motion. Now I'm angled up, okay? If I want to do that with a side hinge screen, I've got to flip it out first and rotate it. It's a two-step process. It takes me twice as long. And by the time you're doing it, if you're trying to be discreet, someone has turned around and gone, what's going on over there? So I get that these types of screens are quicker, but they are also restricted. What's your feeling, Doug? Would you miss a screen do you do a lot of selfies and vlogging?
I do not, and this is the kind of feature that is, each user is going to have a different opinion about it. I don't use that mode. That's not important to me. I don't shoot much video, if at all, so that's not important to me. So, but for someone who does, that might be one of the most important features of the camera. So, that's why we do these reviews, isn't it? Is to point out some of these differences.
We point out the pros and the cons. Now, I did mention the screen is touch sensitive. It's pretty much the same features that you have on the X-T3. The Q menu now becomes touch sensitive. It's great. Sony needs to do that with their function menu. All these cameras, they fit touch screens, which allow you to pull focus. I'll show you that later on in this video. But that's where, say, Sony just says, right, that's all I'm going to let you do. Fujifilm now, at least, does what, say, Canon lets you do. And Panasonic, you can touch your way through some, not all of the user interface. You can swipe and pinch. You can there's gesture recognition during composition, which lets you display various shooting guides like live RGB histograms and a new dual axis leveling gauge. Amazingly, the older models only had a single axis leveling gauge, so that's a feature that really needed to be updated. So it's got that. That's good news. Let's have a look at the ports on the side. So we've got the same ports as the X-T2. We've got a 3.5mm microphone jack, a USB 3 port, HDMI, and a 2.5mm remote jack. Although, as I said, if you're using that for long exposures, you don't need it anymore. You can just dial them straight in. You can now recharge this camera over USB, which is great. And even though it's got a USB 3 port, you can, of course, just use the USB 2 part of it if that's the only cable you've got. It works fine. I tried it with one of my Anker USB batteries. It recharges it absolutely fine. What you will notice, however, and you can use it for tethering. Fujifilm's got two pieces of tethering software. One is dead simple and just literally transfers the pictures straight to your computer. That's free of charge. They also have a more advanced tethering plugin for Lightroom, which costs $79. I think that's maybe a little bit mean. Most people give away their tethering software now, but there you go. At least it works. What you won't find on this is a headphone jack built into the body. Now, there is a solution for this, which I'll come to in a moment, but it's not built in, unlike Sony and Panasonic. They have that now. There is Wi-Fi with Bluetooth. Bluetooth should be good because on models, again, from Sony and Panasonic, the Bluetooth, once the camera is paired with your phone, you should be able to just tap a button in the app and connect to the camera. Well, it doesn't quite happen on the Fujifilm. This is a bit behind. What happens is you pair the camera over Bluetooth, and then you press the connect button on the app. You've got high hopes that it's going to connect and set up the Wi-Fi for you. And then what it actually does, it says, "Oh, hey, could you press the wireless communications button in the camera menu for me?" Yeah, all right. And then the app says, "Oh, could you turn on Wi-Fi on your phone?" I don't know why I'm going into an Australian accent, mate, but that's what it's saying. That's a terrible Australian accent. I apologize to any Australian listeners there, so the app's go, and you're going, yeah, all right. I'll turn on the Wi-Fi on my phone now. The Bluetooth will connect them. It's like, well, Panasonic and Sony, you just press the button and it connects. More to the point, if they're connected over Bluetooth, you don't even need to do anything for those two cameras to start geotagging your images if you want. It just takes that data over Bluetooth from your phone, embeds it in, and you're laughing. Not with Fujifilm. There's still a geotagging button on that app, and when you press it, it says, hey, these location details are going to be available for the next 60 minutes. And same as before, those same locations coordinates are applied to every single image that you take over the next hour, even if you move. So they're all tagged with the location of the first picture.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, you'll have the right country if you're lucky.
Yeah. So you'll be in the same town unless you get in a car, but that's not good. Now, I've been complaining about this for ages, and I should say we filmed this video in March 2018, so hopefully this will be fixed. I've spoken to Fujifilm about this. I spoke to them every time I see them. I spoke to them at the launch of the X-H1, and they said, oh no, we fixed it. So really, oh, it's great. They said, yep. It updates the location every 90 seconds. That's brilliant. Can't wait to try it out. So I tried it out and it still didn't work. Maybe this is coming in an updated version of the app. One thing I was told, though, and I believe that, is that when they do manage to get this working, it will only apply to the models with Bluetooth. So that right now is the X-H1 and the XE3. So sadly, if they update the app, it's still not going to fix this problem on the XT2 or the earlier models. So again, you kind of look at what Sony and Panasonic do. It's just so easy. And Panasonic also do and Canon over Bluetooth. They've got this really simple remote shutter release app on your phone, which has just got a big button to press. You press it and it takes a picture. But that's done over Bluetooth. It doesn't even bother with connecting over Wi-Fi. So there's none of that delay as it connects. Whereas Fujifilm still requires you to connect through Wi-Fi before it actually lets you do stuff, and then you realize that it's not letting you do stuff. Am I making too big a deal about this?
Well, no. I mean, I'm a big fan of geotagging, and you're giving accolades to Sony, but Sony is pretty new to this game in terms of getting it right. A year ago, we wouldn't have said that about Sony, but now they have the ability to update GPS in more or less real time using only Bluetooth and not much battery load either. There's the other side of the camera.
Yeah, so like the XT2, you've got twin memory card slots, and in a kind of take that, Sony, both of them will exploit the speed of UHS Class 2 cards, which is nice because Sony's cameras, even the A9, only one of those slots will exploit UHS 2. The other one's is a slower slot. Now, in another counter argument, this is why you have to delve into these specs, and that's why we do these long reviews. You can configure these two slots to backup, if you like, so it will record all of your still photos to both cards, or you can do like JPEG to one and RAW to the other. So you've got that backup facility, but not for video. The X-H1 will only record, again, maybe there's a way, but I couldn't see it. On my model, it would only record video to one card at a time, whereas say the only Sony A7 III will record video to both cards simultaneously in the same way it would with stills, which could be really useful for you, if you're shooting a one-off event like a wedding or another occasion like that where they're not going to go through those vows again, or hopefully not too soon. Then that's a bit of a shame. So again, these little things you notice. For me, though, the biggest issue, though, you've got this giant grip, right? That giant grip should house a giant battery, right? Sadly not. The X-H1 is powered by exactly the same battery pack as powered the X-T2, and that was a fairly weak battery back then. Now you've got it in a camera that additionally has built-in image stabilization, and guess what? It eats through that battery even faster. I found with image stabilization enabled, I was getting through this battery after only, 100 shots, 200 shots with a little bit of Wi-Fi and a little bit of video. Put it this way, if I was out taking pictures, it would not last me half a day, sometimes less. I regularly went through 3 batteries in one day with this camera. Now, you can luckily top it up over USB, so that's one thing, but I feel this is probably the biggest Achilles heel, actually, of the X-H1, is that when you look at the Sony Mark III A7s, and you look at the Panasonic Lumix G9 and the Olympus OMD M1 Mark II, which was the first one to do it, each one of those companies developed a bigger, significantly bigger battery for their flagship bodies. And they've resolved this issue of battery life for mirrorless. You know, suddenly you've got batteries now that last for ages. I mean, Doug, you shoot quite a lot with an A9 and you've shot with the A7R3. Battery life just isn't an issue on those models now like it was, say, on the Mark II Sonys, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is back to what we were saying earlier, which is the manufacturers have gotten away from trying to emphasize size and weight as the primary advantage. They're saying, okay, we've got full-size cameras now, let's put a full-size battery in it. And like you say, the Mark III Sonys, you can shoot all day on a single battery and never run out.
I should also say, in terms of video, on a single battery on the X-H1, I managed to film about 45 to 50 minutes of 24p 4K footage. And compared to Lumix G9, on one battery, I filmed 2.5 hours. And on the X-H1, the clips of 4K limited to 15 minutes, whereas they're half an hour on the Lumix and the Sony. And you look at that and you think, well, hang on a minute, this is a flagship body. This is an expensive body. Why should I accept that limitation? Now, Fujifilm's answer to this, their solution, is the vertical power booster grip, which we mentioned earlier in the review. Now, this is a different one. It looks the same. It is different to the X-T2's grip because it's got a different base to screw onto, but the principle is the same. You screw this on. Cool, if you're listening to the podcast,
you didn't remove the battery first, did you?
No, and that is one of the cool things about this, is that this grip allows you to use the battery in the camera as well as two additional batteries in the grip itself, and they fit into a tray which is right here. So it will triple your battery life, and that now makes it acceptable, right? That's now an acceptable battery life. Better still, it can actually manage those batteries so that it can reduce the heat in the body, which allows them to extend the movie recording to half an hour per clip. Great. You also get on the side an AC input, which is nice for charging, and a headphone jack as well. Remember we said that was missing? Well, now you get it. You also get the chance to boost some of the performance of the camera itself, like the viewfinder refresh, the autofocus speed. Probably most obviously, the continuous shooting with a mechanical shutter goes from 8 to 11 frames per second, which is nice. But and in a really cool feature, if you have a look at that top LCD again, and I've got the camera switched off, notice how you now have 3 battery icons for the life. That's quite cool, and you can see them on the back of the screen as well. So that's nice. But really, what I'm saying is that in order for this camera to now perform similarly at a similar level, battery-wise, movie clip-wise, speed-wise, to things like a Sony A7 Mark III and a Lumix G9, look what I've had to do to it. I've made a big camera even bigger. Now, this is a significant thing to carry around now. And I've also boosted that price as well as the performance, haven't I? It's now $2,200 is what I'm holding here without the lens. So I kind of... I don't know. It kind of, and then what would have been really nice is that the grip comes with an AC adapter, and when you plug it into the grip, it will recharge the 2 batteries simultaneously, which is but it'll do them both for you, which is really nice. But when you've got the grip attached to the body, it won't also recharge the one in the body, because that would have been even nicer. Imagine, because battery life is an issue for this camera. Imagine if you could just take this home at the end of a day's shooting, because with the battery grip, you should get a day's shooting. Plug it in, and then just know that a few hours later, all 3 of those batteries are charged without any user interaction. That would have been nice, but you can't do that. You've still got to charge the one in the body a different way. So what's your feeling about all of this, Doug? I mean, does this is a pretty serious looking camera now, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the size of the Fuji medium format now, isn't it? It's just about as big. So, yeah, tough call. Though,
don't you, that in order for it to match the battery life and the 30-minute clip length and get the headphone jack, all those things that are free of charge on the bodies of its rivals, I need to fit this grip. It makes a big body even bigger than before and more expensive than before. And I think that to me is becoming a bit of an issue that wasn't such a big problem in the X-T2 because that was a smaller body. With the X-T2, I felt I was willing to accept performance limitations because it was a small body, and I quite liked the way that if you wanted, you could make it a bigger body with the grip and get all that performance back. But if you wanted a small and light body, you could take the grip off. Whereas this camera is big to start with, and I expect performance.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, this is the camera where they could have made the jump to the larger battery because they have all that real estate under that little square display there. This would have been the chance. I mean, less than a year ago, I was shooting with cameras where I had to carry 3 batteries in my pockets to do a day of shooting. So this doesn't surprise me, except for the fact of the timing, that this would have been the chance to make that leap.
Yeah, and remember, this is not like a mid-range or an entry-level body. This is a flagship body that's very expensive, the most expensive body in the series. So I'm disappointed they didn't update that.
Just remember, though, we criticized Sony forever until they made this change less than a year ago. So, yeah, what can I say? They should have done it.
They should have done it. I want to talk about stabilization now, because that's something Fujifilm should have done a long time ago and now have finally done. As you'll recall, previously on the Camera Labs Photography podcast, we discussed how Fujifilm said that built-in stabilization was impossible on the X series due to their very tight imaging circle. The imaging circle, of course, is the area projected from the back of the lens within which the image meets a certain standard. And the idea is that you fit the sensor inside that, or rather you fit the circle around the sensor. Now, if your sensor's moving, then it's going to protrude into those areas beyond the imaging circle where the quality may not be as good. So your kind of two compromises are: you either design lenses that have got bigger imaging circles, therefore more expensive, larger, heavier, or you accept that compromise or deal with it in some way. So I asked Fujifilm, how is this possible? How did you manage to do the impossible? And they said, well, combination of a couple of things, which you just said. Some of their better lenses have a bit more wriggle room than perhaps they implied. The imaging circle is actually acceptable beyond the sensor size. Also, it wasn't so much a softening of the image in the corners that you'd be facing once you went beyond. It was more a vignetting problem, a darkening in the corners. And they found that they could actually correct that in software. So the result is the X-H1, their first body with built-in image stabilization. And that's part of the reason why this camera is so big. Also that it's got bigger heat sinks in it to deal with the higher video bit rates that I'll discuss later on in this video. So Fujifilm reckon it's good for up to 5.5 stops of compensation. It is, in fact, dependent on the lens you attach. Some of them will only give you about 2.5 stops. Interestingly, the 10 to 24 and the 18 to 55 zooms, they're two of the lenses that will have the least benefit of this system. In fact, probably no benefit at all. But you don't really care because they've got optical stabilization. Where you really want this is on their primes that don't have optical stabilization. And for those, Fuji's claiming, around 5 stops for each of those. So I made sure I got hold of as many lenses as I could, and I tried the stabilization on this. Now, one of my favorite lenses in the Fujifilm series is this. This is the 90mm f2. This is a super, super sharp lens here. So it's sort of 135mm equivalent, sort of mid-range telephoto. Lengthwise quality, it's superb. And at f2, you can really throw those backgrounds out. But it doesn't have optical stabilization. And as you know, my hands shake quite a lot. And I literally cannot handhold this lens very effectively. When I was testing this, I was very frustrated with it. Because what I like to do is, I like to get everything in camera. I don't like to do any post-production, as this book behind me over my right shoulder says, in camera. And that includes cropping. I don't want to crop those images. So if I want to get a subject, like an architectural subject, slap bang in the middle of the frame, and I want to make sure it is exactly in the middle of the frame. I enable the grid, the alignment grid, and I position, say, an architectural element, at the top of an arch, right in the middle of the frame. And I need to hold the camera super steady, super steady to be able to make those fine adjustments. Well, I couldn't do that with that 90mm at all. I could, of course, select a nice fast shutter speed to avoid camera shake, but I couldn't hold it still enough to compose it as precisely as I wanted. And for video, forget about it. In fact, I'm going to show you 2 video clips now. Here's a video clip filmed with the 90mm without stabilization. And obviously it's horrible. This clip is unusable. And you can see that my particular kind of camera shake is really not just wobbling the picture, but has really triggered the rolling shutter and the skewing there. It looks nasty. Here it is with the stabilization turned on. And it might not be floating quite as eerily as, say, Panasonic and Olympus can now, but that is a massive improvement. You can see right now that that's working. And for shooting stills, it was it's not a revelation because you know what it's going to look like. It just works. Suddenly that picture becomes very, very steady. I could compose precisely with the 90mm, the 56, which is another favorite of mine, and also that 16 to 55mm zoom, which I've got mounted on the camera. that's actually, because it's quite heavy, that's not so easy to handhold at 55mm, because this lens didn't have stabilization either. And again, I like the quality of this lens, but I never wanted to buy it. I never wanted to own it because I couldn't hold it steadily enough on the older bodies, but now I can. And it's really transformed my use of that. In terms of the actual performance, I did tests on all of these lenses, and I found that I was getting a good, solid, reliable 3 stops, maybe 3.5 stops out of all of these lenses that I've mentioned, not 5. If I was lucky, sometimes I got 5, but it wasn't consistent or reliable. Reliably 3 to 3.5. And that kind of reminds me a bit of when Sony and Panasonic first started their body-based stabilization. It was good, but it wasn't amazing. It wasn't eerie yet. But it was certainly very usable. And I feel that's where Fuji is now with this system. I mean, Doug, what's your feeling on like using longer non-stabilized lenses with and without stabilization?
Well, you mentioned something very important. I, for one, don't use slow shutter speeds for most of my photography. So image stabilization, in order to pick up the ability to shoot longer exposures, slower shutter speeds, isn't critical. However, as you said, when using longer lenses, it's critical for being able to compose the image, because these longer lenses, sometimes you can't hold the camera still enough to see what it is you're shooting. And that's a big plus that people often forget about. So that to me is a benefit. And I'm glad that Fuji finally figured out that, yes, they really can do this with their sensor. How marvelous.
Yeah, now the big question is the size of the X-H1, how much of this size of this body is down to that stabilization? How much is it down to the heat sinks for the 200 megabit video? How much is it just down to they wanted a bigger, chunkier body that was tougher? The question then leading to, could you fit that stabilization in an X-T2 body? I would like that smaller body. Look at Sony. An A7 Mark III is smaller than this, and they managed to stabilize a full frame sensor in it. Will Fuji be able to miniaturize this? I don't know, but I'll leave you with this. Here's a video of me attempting to use the X-H1 for vlogging purposes. So I'm shooting this completely blind with the camera held in front of me. I can't see how I look or anything because the screen doesn't face forward. And I'm hand holding the 16 to 55 millimeter, so using the body-based stabilization alone. And you can see that it's certainly usable, but if you look close, you'll notice that there's a kind of slight choppiness to it. Now, admittedly, I was using a shutter speed that is faster than you should for video, but the choppiness that you're seeing is more down to the kind of deflection range of that stabilization. It's all because you can see it when you pan when you're filming video with this camera. As you try and pan, if you do it slowly, it's okay. If you try and do it any faster, the stabilization kind of mistakes your panning for shake, and it kind of corrects and jumps back. So you get this kind of jerky movement, whether you're moving it left, right, up or down. And you can see that as I walk along here. It's not that eerie smoothness that we've come to enjoy from Olympus for a long time, and now from Panasonic, and increasingly from Sony is getting better at it too. Fujifilm, it's still early days, but I'm pleased to see it, because when I reviewed the X-T2, the 2 complaints I had about it were that it didn't have a touchscreen, it didn't have stabilization. Now they're both here. And when the X-T3 had Bluetooth, I said I want Bluetooth now, because even though they need to do some software work on it, I want the hardware in there. So the X-H1 has all of that, which is very nice.
But another thing that I've noticed now with some of the cameras, we have in the lens stabilization in particular, we have a switch that says mode 1, mode 2 are off. And mode 2 in most cases is what they call the sports mode or the panning mode. And in that case, the image stabilization is on in the vertical planes only, but it allows you to pan horizontally without that sort of stuttering look that you get as the camera tries to stabilize horizontally and then realizes, oh, I can't, I've got to jump to the next section or so forth. Does this camera have those 2 modes? Does it have a a vertical only stabilization?
Not for the built-in stabilization, but then to be fair, none of the cameras I've come across that have built-in stabilization offer that either. You can normally either just turn it on or off. Sometimes, like in the case of the X-H1, you can have it only come on when you take the picture, or have it on all the time. Obviously, that consumes more power, but I like that so that I can use it for composition. What you're describing there with the where it switches off, say, 2 of the axes, that's more of a kind of lens optical stabilization thing. Although equally, maybe the cameras that do support kind of better looking stabilization when you're panning are detecting that horizontal motion and maybe switching it off or disabling it or reducing it in some regard. But the bottom line is, if you are panning while filming video with the X-H1, you will see a certain degree of jerkiness that you won't see on the Olympus and Panasonic bodies. So it's good, it's useful, but it's not quite as good as those bodies yet. It's version 1, and hopefully that's something that will see improved, and hopefully it's something they'll be able to squeeze into smaller bodies, because it would be a shame if you could only get that stabilization in a giant body like the X-H1. So moving on, I think we wanted to talk about autofocus and sort of general handling now. Now, because it's got the same sensor as the X-T2 and all the other X-Trans 3 products, the autofocus system is going to be pretty similar as well. There's an embedded phase detect autofocus system that covers roughly 50% of the width of the frame, 75% of the vertical. So it reaches almost the top and bottom, but it only goes about halfway across. Now, that's nowhere near the almost full coverage that you get on, say, a Sony A7 III. But conversely, it's still bigger than the typical lozenge you get in the middle of a typical DSLR. So better than that, not as good as some of its mirrorless rivals. And Fuji's improved some respects of it. It now operates at light levels down to -1 EV. Again, not as dim as some of its rivals, but better than the X-T2. It also still operates at f11 rather than f8, which is great if you're using, say, one of these giant lenses with a teleconverter. Then, it will still autofocus. And you still get those different profiles that you get on the X-T2, where you can say, look, something's going to jump into the frame suddenly. So, be prepared for that. Now, for me, in terms of the sort of overall autofocus performance and speed, it inevitably felt similar to the X-T2. And as such, it's very dependent on the lens you're shooting with, because some of the lenses are pretty slow. But if you're using the newer ones or those sporty zooms, like the 100 to 400 or 50 to 140, it can be pretty snappy. Now, when you're shooting portraits, say with the 90mm or with the 56mm or with the 16 to 55 at 55, I noticed that the face detection, face as in the face on the front of your head, is working pretty well, and there is eye detection as well. But what I did notice, having shot a lot with the Sony A7 III recently, is the eye detection did not, or in fact, to be fair, even compared to the Lumix G9, the eye detection was not as sticky and not as confident. It would go on, it would go off, whereas on those rival bodies, the eye detection was pretty much there all the time. A lot of the time it wasn't on the X-H1. The X-H1 also can't use eye detection with continuous autofocus, and I believe it's contrast-based only. Doesn't use the phase detect AF system. So again, when you compare it to what Sony are doing, Sony supports eye detection with continuous autofocus, that it works all over the frame. It's very sticky. I've had subjects literally spinning around, and the moment that their face becomes visible, that little square appears over the eye. It just works really, really well. So again, it's very easy to compare specs and say, hey, they've both got eye detection, but it's still not quite performing as well as some of its rivals. If you're shooting action, I shot birds in flight with the 100 to 400 millimeter, and I used the wide area AF. And as soon as birds entered the frame, it wasn't locking onto them again anywhere near as confidently as, again, a Sony A7 III or something like a Nikon D500, much more confident over a broad area. If I zoned that AF into an area, a smaller region, then it became more confident, more responsive. But again, for birds, I was maybe only getting like a 50% hit rate on the seagulls around Brighton. If the subject's more predictable, like someone cycling towards you, this time I deployed my friend Nick, not Ben, to cycle towards me around the velodrome. You'll see results of that in my review at camlabs.com. When he was cycling straight towards me, even at, say, 30, 35 miles an hour, it was managing to track him pretty well. But again, zoning that down as opposed to that wider area. You can shoot at 8 frames per second or 11 frames per second with a mechanical shutter, but you're not getting live feedback between those frames. You've got to slow it down to nearer 5 if you want live feedback. So again, it falls behind what, say, Sony's doing. It'll do 8 frames per second with live feedback. And also, if you're shooting at 14 frames per second with the electronic shutter, which you can do without the grip, beware of skewing artifacts. Now, most cameras currently suffer from that. The A9 is taking the lead in that regard, but still isn't completely immune from it. If you are panning quickly from side to side, or your subject's moving quickly across the frame, you will see some artifacts where they kind of become skewed and bent and all that. But, there are benefits to using the electronic shutter. You do get a completely silent shutter, you're operating in silence. And in the case of the Fuji, you get shutter speeds up to 32,000th of a second. But I wanted to actually demonstrate the shutter to you, Doug, because it's a kind of newish mechanism on the X-H1 where they've got new damping that makes it even quieter than before. So I'm going to demonstrate the loudest, worst possible case scenario, which is the full mechanical shutter. So have a listen to this. You hear that?
And the beep.
And the beep. That shutter is quiet, man. Very, very quiet. Possibly the quietest mechanical shutter I've ever heard. And if there is any ambient noise around, you say you're shooting outside or, in a room where people are talking, you're not going to hear it. And that's the worst case scenario. You can switch the electronic shutter if you want it even quieter. And there's also a new electronic first curtain mode. But the full mechanical, so quiet. So that is really nice. I was very impressed with that. Would that be useful to you, Doug? You shoot a lot of events, don't you?
Yeah, it's probably not. I'm guessing it's not as quiet as a leaf shutter. In some of those, but for a focal plane shutter, it sounds like it's pretty good.
Yeah. Now, the autofocus obviously also works for movies, although most confidently if you're staying within that square phase detect region. And if you're doing some casual filming, here's a clip I filmed handheld with a 16 to 55 at 16mm 2.8. And this is with a 50th of a second. This is a motion-friendly shutter speed, so any choppiness you see here is down to that stabilization. But you'll notice how it will refocus quite nicely, as I move around this room. It's the guitar shop in Brighton, GAK, and that works pretty well. The touch screen also lets you pull focus by touch. So here's another clip that I filmed. This is in another one of my favorite shops in Brighton, Buy Some Beer. And I've got these two cans here, and I'm using the touch screen to tap to pull focus between the can in the foreground and the can in the background. Now, this I made very sure to be careful that I was tapping within the phase detect area. This is not a contrast-based area. And you'll notice that it just kind of, it'll refocus, then it'll go, have I gone far? No, I need to, no. Yeah, now I'm there. Now I'm going to, shall I? A bit more? Now I'm going to, it's just lacking the confidence, again, I'm going to mention Sony again. It just goes zoom and stops. Even Panasonic, which is a contrast-based system, zoom and stops. So, Canon as well with dual pixel CMOS AF very rarely overshoots. Now, you can tell that this is not a contrast-based system because it's not hunting in the same way as a contrast-based system would. It feels like it's a timid phase detect AF system. So it knows what to do. It's just a little bit nervous about doing it. Little things like that. So sticking with movies, you can film 4K UHD as before. New to the X-H1 is it will do cinema 4K, only at 24p though. You can do UHD up to 30p. It's a minor 1.17 times cropped, same as the X-T2. The X-T2 was limited to 10-minute clips of 4K video. Now the X-H1, because it's bigger and heftier, it can extend that to 15 minutes per clip. Still not half an hour though. You need that grip to get it to half an hour. That's a bit of a shame. But it will now film 4K up to 200 megabits per second. So that's a nice high bit rate if you want it. And more importantly, for someone lazy like me who doesn't like to grade, there is a new Eterna film simulation. Now, you can apply this to stills if you want, but it works best for video. All of the video clips we've shown so far, in fact, throughout, are all filmed with Eterna because it's really good. Fuji's color science is great, and Eterna gives you a nice kind of natural looking output that's sufficiently flat you can grade it if you want, but I think it looks pretty good out of camera. And I've posted a lot of these clips before we filmed this podcast, and most of the comments that I've got from people is like, gosh, that looks really nice just out of the camera. You don't feel you need to do anything to it. And in another really good addition over the X-T2, you can film their completely flat F-Log onto SD cards in camera, whereas on the X-T2 it only came out the HDMI port. And you can now, here's another clip I'm going to show you that it can film 1080 video up to 120p and interpret it in camera down to say 24-25p for slowdown. So I filmed this at 100p, interpreted it to 25 for a 4 times slowdown of these seagulls flying around Brighton Beach and catching chips thrown up by tourists. So again, it's got quite a few additional movie features compared to the X-T2, but I feel that, most or all of this is already present on its rivals. Panasonic and Sony let you film log profiles in camera. They do slow motion. Cinema 4K is still quite unusual. Sony still doesn't offer you that on its A7 series, but you're not a movie guy though, are you, Doug? You're not that excited. You're wishing that I move on to the next bit, aren't you?
No, I'm fascinated by it. I've looked at your video stuff before we did the review. I love the eternal look. I think it's really nice. And looking at the F-Log video, if I were to want to grade my footage, that very low contrast starting point looks terrific, actually. You don't want to release it in that format. You want to do the grading to bring the contrast up, but it looks pretty good.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd be very happy with Eterna as it is. And Jordan from the Camera Store, good friend of mine who does all of their video side of things, he really likes Eterna and can see an application where you would use the X-H1 just to, shoot footage you can use out of camera without any grading, say if you want to do a job really quickly. I'd also like to mention, also new to the X-H1 movies, there are now touch controls, so you can operate it silently, but perhaps more importantly, it lets you effectively ignore the hard dials on the top of the body. Now, this is very frustrating on the previous bodies because you would need to be turning these dials to get motion-friendly shutter speeds, and then you'd switch back to stills and you'd be turning it all the way around to go to a faster speed. Now, what you can do is use the silent touch controls to set your movie exposure, and then when you switch back into still photo mode, it ignores those and it goes back to the physical dials. And then when you go back to movie, it ignores the physical dials, goes back to the touch thing. So the touch controls may be a little bit kind of convoluted the way the menus work on screen, but it allows you to effectively have two different banks of settings, one for stills and one for video. And also, I mentioned earlier the 48th of a second shutter speed, which appears when you're in movie mode, doesn't appear when you're in stills. That's a nice touch. There is focus peaking, but there's no zebra patterns. There is no headphone jack unless you've got the grip. There's that limited clip length, limited battery life. All these things resolved by models like the Lumix G9 and the Sony A7 III, and the G9 screen also faces forward. So the video is better than before, and that footage does look good, but I just feel they've fallen a bit behind.
Yeah, it sounds like there are a few misses. It comes back really to the Fuji advantage for people who are Fuji fans, and there are many of them. I'm a Fuji fan, although I don't own a Fuji camera at this time, but it's the type of controls that the Fuji offers, and it's the image quality. It's just to mention that beautiful book behind you, that in-camera book. These are all the Fujifilm cameras are great for people who want to use the film simulations, who want to shoot JPEG. That's where they really shine. And if someone asks me the question, what camera should I buy? If they're a JPEG shooter, I will often end up recommending one of the Fuji cameras. And my big question here, though, is, is it worth the premium compared to the X-T2, the X-T20, and even the X-E3? That's really what it comes down to for me. If I wanted a Fuji camera, I could spend anywhere between $2,200 for this camera with a grip and only $900 for the little X-E3.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk about image quality. You said everything I wanted to say. It's the same sensor as the X-T2. There's some minor tweaks to it, but essentially, you know what the image quality is going to be like. And this is Fujifilm's strong point. Their color science is fantastic. The JPEGs and the movies look brilliant out of camera. So if, like me, you don't want to do much work, then or any work at all in post, it's a fantastic system to use. And the lenses are also very, very good quality. So, image quality is their highlight. But it is not an upgrade over those other bodies in image quality. And that wouldn't matter if it was the X-T20 or an X-E3, which is a kind of mid-range camera brought out after the flagship bodies. But this is a new flagship body that's more expensive than the previous flagship bodies, and yet it has a sensor that is now 2 years old. The X Pro 2 introduced this sensor exactly 2 years ago, a little bit more than 2 years ago, actually. So that makes me nervous a little bit. Now, 2018 is a photo keener year. I have no advance information on this, by the way, but September, when the show happens in Cologne in Germany, is typically when a lot of new cameras come out. And I don't know, maybe now that the X-Trans 3 sensor is on every camera in the Fujifilm range, there's no other cameras they can put it on, apart from the X70, but they won't put it in that because the battery would be too small. What are they going to do? The only thing they can do is go to a new sensor, right? I don't know if it'll be this year or next year, but it will inevitably happen. And you've got to ask yourself, this X-H1 is probably, this is pure speculation. I'd be interested to hear, Doug, what you think, and also in the comments, could this be the last body to feature the X-Trans 3, at least at this end of the market? And if it is, now, the image quality is good enough for me, but there is that little feeling in the back of your head that, is there going to be something better coming in the future? If I'm going to be buying a flagship body, I kind of want an image quality upgrade as well. And that also comes along when you've got like the full frame Sony A7 III available for much the same price. It's a tricky one. Then you've got that battery as well. It's still using that old battery. Again, for a flagship body, a big body, something I'm spending a lot of money on, I wouldn't mind new battery technology. So for me, the two things that bother me is that it's got the existing sensor and the existing battery, when in fact a body of this class should probably be having something superior. Now, don't get me wrong, I've got a downer on that, but on the upside, this resolves any issues I had with the X-T2. Yes, it's not quite as charming because it's not as small anymore, but it does now have stabilization. Those lenses are incredibly usable. It has a touchscreen. It has Bluetooth, which needs a bit of work, but at least it has it. You know, it's still got the image quality that I loved before. That's not changed. You know, it's still there. So if you're committed to the X mount and you've got a lot of X lenses, this is the most capable body to date. Question is, though, is if you are coming at this, say, from a body costing half the price, let's say you're a mid-range owner looking to go to a higher-end body and you don't have that much of a commitment in lenses yet, is it worth jumping ship? You know, if you go to something like an Olympus EM1 Mark II or a Panasonic Lumix G9, you'll be getting better video, better stabilization, and really neat features like being able to pre-capture some stills before you fully press the shutter release, you know, for birds in flight taking off. That sort of thing is amazing, you know, for capturing the moments. Or you could go with Sony and get a full frame sensor for much the same price, or the A6500 is cheaper if you're happy with APS-C. There's a lot of stuff going on. So it's a really difficult one to wrap up for me personally. I think it's obviously a very capable camera, a very, very good camera, but I do wish the battery life was better. I don't want to have to feel I have to use that grip in order to match what I'm getting with a lot of its rivals. But if you are using the X system, again, it is the most capable body that's out there. And I did enjoy shooting with it a lot. What are your feelings, Doug?
I think it just proves the old paradigm, the old discussion says the best camera is the one that comes out right after you buy one. It's always the case. I mean, all the cameras in the last 2 years have been so remarkable. I can't, you know, my photography has not yet kept up with the quality of the cameras that we've seen in the last 24 months. So anyway, Gordon, another great review. I want to remind everybody that this is just our video review. If you want everything you ever wanted to know about the X-H1 or any of the cameras we've mentioned here on the podcast, go to cameralabs.com and read Gordon's in-depth reviews. As I said to a friend the other day, there is nobody who will tell you more and more objectively about what you want to know about these cameras than Gordon does. Cameras, lenses, it's all there. Take a look at Gordon's book, In Camera, which is marvelous. For people who want to shoot JPEGs, the images are terrific as well. And if you're interested in workshops, go to dougk.com, look at my stuff. But Gordon, it's been a pleasure once again. I look forward to the next episode of the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Anything else?
Yeah, please subscribe. If you're listening to this on the podcast, please rate us on iTunes or whichever other podcast system you're using. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. It really, really helps us and allows our videos to be seen by more people if you subscribe. So please do that. There's an icon in the corner of the screen. Come on, you've got time to click it if you haven't already. If you stuck with us for an hour, you might as well, or skipped forward to the bit at the end, you naughty, naughty people. And as Doug says, you know, if you want to treat us to a coffee, there's a link in the description, in the comments below the video. So everything you need to know. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And that's it from me.
Okay. See you next time on the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Bye-bye.